Hey everybody, I am here with Ed, aka Space Invader One. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Bob.
Well, I wanted you on here to talk about the work that you've been doing teaching people how to use something called UnRAID. And I also wanted to learn more about you and your background and how you got into all of this stuff, because I've learned quite a bit from your videos, and so have quite a few other people as well. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe could you give us a little bit of an overview of what UnRAID is and what your channel's about, and then we'll kind of dig in deeper into both of those.
Well, UnRAID is a home server operating system based off Linux. It's used for file storage, running Docker containers, and VMs. I got involved in UnRAID probably about 7 or 8 years ago, back in 2012, 2013. I was looking for a NAS to set up. I'd had like a Buffalo link station and had bad experiences with that. So I thought I was going to build my own. I built my own UnRAID server, and as many people who do, they build one thinking, I just want storage. And then they find out all the other things it can do, and they keep upgrading and upgrading and upgrading.
Very cool. And you do instructional videos from 10-minute little clips of how to do one thing to very deep dives on how to set things up, walk people through step by step. And I mean, your videos cover pretty much everything that you would need to know. The only thing that the watcher would have to do is search through your channel and figure out what they need for today. So if you're getting started, obviously watch the longer videos. If you've already dug deep and you just need the answer, try to look for the shorter ones. But it's been a really excellent resource, and you come highly recommended by a very picky friend of mine. So that's how I knew for sure your channel was worth watching, because they would not have recommended you if it wasn't. So, by the way, I just gotta say, it's definitely weird hearing your voice, because I don't think you're ever in your videos, and I've watched so many of them, and people say that to me, like when I do the interview, it's weird talking with me because they watch the weekly podcast, and now I know how they feel, because I'm so used to listening to you tell me what to do, and now we're here having a chat.
Yeah, I'm always undercover in my video, so this is about the first time I think I've been on screen, other than one other time.
Oh, really? It's funny. Quite a few people have said that this was the first time they've been on camera, and one, they said it was even their first time doing audio publicly. So I'm always very honored that people put their trust in me, that I'm not going to set them up to make them look stupid, because I think anybody that watches this channel knows that if anybody's going to look dumb, it's me. So you have nothing to worry about. But so UnRAID for us, and by us I mean general nerds or people in the retro gaming community, I think that there's a few things about it that are very attractive to me. The first thing is that you don't need to have matching hard drives. So I won't go so deep into the IST stuff, but I will give a very brief overview if someone listening isn't familiar or forgets. But if you're setting up something like a Buffalo link station, you're really supposed to have all matching hard drives, all the same size, and ideally the same brand and model as well. And for that, an UnRAID makes zero difference. The only requirement is that your parity drive, should you have one, which you probably should if if you have an array that's very important to you of backups, that's going to be the biggest drive or equal to the biggest drive. And that's all that matters. You're then only limited by the amount of SATA ports on your computer, and everything comes together looking like one drive or multiple, however you partition it. But it works just like a software RAID array, but nothing has to match. And on top of that, if something should happen, if lightning strikes and kills your motherboard, but the drives are still there, you could put those drives in any Linux machine that could read the BTFS?
BTRFS or ButterFS.
BTRFS file system and get your data back, correct?
Or XFS. Most people on the array, we use XFS on the array and ButterFS on the cache.
So that is a huge thing for me, because I actually had a Buffalo NAS that's a home version of it, I think back in 2011 or something like that. And because it was a home version and it wasn't like in an office environment, when the NAS died, I lost everything that was on it. Now, luckily it was a backup, so I basically just had to, I was only nervous for the few days it took to re-back up the files, but I think that's something a lot of people miss, and a lot of my fellow nerds seem to skip over, especially if they do IT for a living, because they just go, oh, just get a RAID array. It's so much easier. Yeah, that's great if you're in a corporate environment and you have a backup of a backup. But if that is your only backup and you risk your data that way, I just, that makes me nervous. And I've almost lost critical data before. I did lose it. I had to recover it and stuff like that. So just the fact that any drive could be thrown in and you could get the data back afterwards, that for me, for home use, makes the most sense, especially for people that might have stacks of older hard drives laying around that, as long as you have a PC tower big enough.
And another good thing, Bob, is like when you have a normal RAID array and you run out of space, well, you're stuck. You have to get another RAID array. You can't actually expand it. The lovely thing about UnRAID is, you've got, say, a 20 terabyte array. You become full. You just throw another hard drive in and expand it, and you don't lose any data, no downtime. You don't have to copy all of that data off that one RAID array, put it somewhere else, make a new RAID array with the disks, add another disk in. You don't have to do any of that. It's really flexible in the fact that you can just keep expanding as your data needs grow. And, when you just have a few drives, you may have one parity drive. And as you start getting more and you think, well, maybe more than one drive might fail, you can add a second parity drive, to keep your data protected in the case of a drive failure. So, I think a lot of people overlook the fact that, they'll buy a commercial RAID system and they're stuck with that size until they want, more space, and they have to kind of, provision something else.
Yeah, I definitely want to get back into parity, but the last overview, and by the way, this is not sponsored by UnRAID, this is my personal opinion, so if I'm gushing over it and your channel, this is just my honest opinions. No one's paying me to say this, but the other reason that I really liked UnRAID is I got it all set up. I had it set up with a smaller desktop PC tower, and I liked it, and I decided I wanted to keep it, and then I realized I was very quickly running out of space. So the PC that I was using was actually originally built to record for like Pro Tools and stuff like that. So I traded it to a friend of mine who had a PC that was slightly different spec, but in a giant tower. And I was like, I watched a couple of your videos. I did some research. I wanted to make sure, okay, let me transfer this array over to a new PC. Based on my previous nerd experience, I'm probably going to get sucked in for like a day's worth of work. And I literally unplugged the drives from the old machine, plugged them into the new one, booted, and then just had to go through the drop-down menus and restart the array, and that was it. I thought it was going to be a day's project, and moving all of my drives from one computer to a completely different computer took as long as it took to just physically move the drives. So I think that stuff that we just mentioned is reason alone for people who want home backups to use this if they're comfortable building PCs and repurposing stuff. But there's a few other things we'll get into later, which I think is going to be very appealing to the retro gaming community as well. But I guess to get people started, and maybe we could take notes so I could make sure to have the videos of yours that match exactly what we're talking about in the description. But so I guess I'll leave myself a little note here real quick just so I could do it. But for people starting out, you need a USB stick that's bootable, which is most of them, but I guess there are some cheap ones that have issues. And you could do a free trial, but what are the basic steps? And do you have a video that you would recommend today for people that wanted to just try this out and see?
Yep. Probably the video to watch is my UnRAID 6.9 series, where I guide people through basically setting up a basic server with 6.9, which is the latest stable release. Setting up the USB stick, it's really simple. You just download a creator tool on Windows, Mac, or Linux, plug your USB flash drive into the computer. It will make that bootable for you. You then plug that into what you want to use as a server. Make sure the motherboard's set to boot from the USB stick. It will boot up straight into the operating system. You'll see an IP address come up at the end of the process. Type that into your browser and you're straight into the UnRAID web UI, and you'll see any hard disks that are connected. And then you can start creating your array, and you're off straight away.
Yeah, and I do also want to add that if you feel like testing this out, but you don't have spare equipment just laying around, you could take your existing PC. I would recommend pulling the power from any drives that you have in there, just because if you pull the power from that, you don't have to worry about accidentally writing to it, and you don't have to worry about putting the SATA cables back in the right order, because with no power, it's not going to access it anyway. So you could just pull the power from your existing drives. You could add in a USB stick to boot from, and any one hard drive of any size, just to mess around and get started.
Exactly. Even just a USB hard drive, if you don't want to put a SATA one in, plug a USB hard drive in, set it as your disk one, and you'll be able to test it and have a look around and have a look at the interface and see if you like it or not.
Yeah, awesome. So in that video that you put, the UnRAID 6.9 series, I can't remember which ones I've watched, to be honest, because I've watched so many, but is that the one that you show people how to get started, how to add the drive to the array, and then how to add the basic software like fix common problems?
Yeah, so basically I guide people through setting it up, adding the drives, and also how to transfer data from existing computers onto the UnRAID array. So if you've got other hard drives from other computers, they might be in the wrong file system, like you've got some Windows hard drives that are formatted in NTFS. You can just plug them in, and I guide you through fairly easy ways of transferring the data onto the array.
Very cool.
So to be honest, I made that video about a year ago, so I can't really quite remember everything in it, but
yeah, fair enough.
That's definitely the plan, and making it is basically guiding a user. I think there's about sort of 4 or 5 videos in the 6.9 series that takes you from the basics, and each one going on from there.
Makes sense. So and once again, for people listening, we're going to get to the why this applies to retro gamer stuff pretty soon, but so when you get this set up, if you wanted to leave it just as a basic array with 1 or 2 or however many hard drives you have, and then never touch it again, all you really need to do is set up your shares, and that's kind of it. It'll just sit on your network as a network attached storage, and you don't need to do anything else. But there are a lot of things that you recommend in your videos that, after messing with them, I wholeheartedly agree that I think if anybody needs to do just anything other than basic file storage, a second backup type of thing, I would recommend doing as well. And the first one is installing an app that easily allows you to download other apps and plugins. So it's kind of like downloading an open source app store, I guess would be a somewhat decent analogy, right?
Yep. So basically just downloading the community applications plugin. In the latest version of UnRAID, which is the RC version, which isn't stable yet, you can just click a button and it will automatically download that app store. But in 6.9, the stable version, you do have to actually install the plugin manually. You just go onto the UnRAID forums and find the thread into do with fix common problems. You just copy and paste the line of code for the address, paste it in, and then you've got community applications. And like you say, it's just like an app store. You can browse various plugins and Docker containers, and it's just a one-click install.
So at first, I was kind of wondering what that would entail, because I'm not very fluid in Linux. My Linux developer friends are all laughing at me now that I say that out loud, but it really is as easy as copying and pasting a URL from Google, fix common problems, UnRAID. You'll see the forum post, copy and paste the URL, and that's it. It does it all for you.
Yeah.
So your guides walk you through it pretty, step by step to make it easy, but just to oversimplify it, getting this set up is really as easy as clicking on a few things and pasting a few web URLs in there and getting set up. Now, for people who know that this is going to be important for them, not a second backup, but their main backup, when do you suggest a parity drive should come into play? And I guess for people that are not used to these terms, maybe you could describe what in your own words what a parity drive is.
Okay, so how parity works is your parity drive protects the data drives that you have in your array. So should one of those data drives fail, you can actually rebuild the data that was on that failed disk by popping in another hard drive, and it will rebuild the lost data that was on that drive. Now, a lot of people kind of wonder, how that works, because, say you've got 4 data drives and 1 parity drive. How does that 1 parity drive know what was on any one of those 4 drives?
Right, well, and especially if you have something like one 18 terabyte parity drive and then 4 18 terabyte regular drives that's part of your array, how can that back up 4 drives that are each the same size?
Exactly. So, as we know, hard drives have what's called sectors on the hard drive. And on that sector, there's either going to be a 1 or a 0, nothing else. So how the parity drive works is it's called the Xor algorithm. And what happens is, if you imagine just the first sector of the disk, for instance, there's either going to be a 1 or a 0 on either of those disks. So those are added up, and the answer is either going to be odd or even. So let's say we've got 3 disks. The first 2 have a 1 on, and the last one has a 0. So that is an even answer on the parity drive. So adding those up comes to 2. So the parity drive just writes even. So if one of those 3 drives fails, say the one with the 0 on, so we take that drive out. So the parity only knows the answer. So what it has to do is it queries the other 2 drives that are there. And so 1 plus 1 is 2. So it knows that the answer is even. So that last disk that had failed, that must be a 0 there. So it knows that that's a 0 on there. And that works for every single sector across. And that's how it rebuilds the parity and rebuilds your data. So it doesn't actually have a copy of your data, but it has the answer to an algorithm that enables you to actually be able to recover your data from that. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and it does sound a little bit like magic, to be honest with you. But I mean, anybody in IT has done a RAID rebuild, whether it's through software like UnRAID or a hardware system. So it does absolutely work. This isn't new technology. It's been around for a very, very long time, and it always did kind of seem like magic to me. But it definitely does work. Now, the one thing that I'm actually still not sure about myself is I have one 18 terabyte drive as my parity, and then 18, 16, 12, and 10 as my regular drives, because I was able to collect those over the years, because every time my desktop drive got filled, I would buy the next bigger one in line and keep the other one as the backup, which is why I've stepped up like that. So at what point, or if any point, would I want to add a second parity drive? Is it just to back up the first parity drive, or is there a size limitation for it?
Well, what 2 parity drives allow you to do is to have 2 drives fail in the array at once. So say you've got 5 hard drives in your array, one of them fails and you've only got 1 parity drive, and then you start making a rebuild. Rebuilding a disk is quite strenuous on the hard drives. So if you imagine, you've bought, you set up your UnRAID server, you buy kind of 5 drives, and then 4 years later, one of the drives fails. Well, the chances are you might have bought all of those 4 drives or 5 drives at the same time, so they're all 4 years old. So when you're rebuilding the array and the strain is on the hard drives, you have got a chance, because they're the same age, that you might get another failure during the rebuild. So if you get another failure during the rebuild can't complete. But the wonderful thing about UnRAID is if that does happen, you only lose the data on the drives that fail. The other drives that are still okay, you still got the data there. Unlike a traditional array, unlike a
hardware RAID array, yeah,
yeah, unlike a hardware or traditional kind of RAID 5. If you lose a disk and you can't recover from it, you lose all of your data on the array.
Right, which is so appealing for at-home use. So that's pretty interesting. And another common scenario that I've absolutely run into before. Sorry.
Like your question asking, when should you add another one? If you can afford it, right at the beginning. But I say, if you go over 5 data drives, get 2 parity drives. The more hard drives you have in your system, the more chance you've got of more than one drive failing, and then you're not able to recover from it. So, if you can afford it at the beginning, buy 2. If you can't, once you get over 5 drives, maybe kind of think about adding a second parity.
That makes sense. And a very, very common scenario that I've run into my whole life, being a kid that figured out how to fix all their family members' computers, up to the adult that I am now that still has to fix all their family members' computers. It's so common for something like there's a rainstorm and lightning strikes, and somebody's router and cable modem die at the same time, and then one of their hard drives dies, and then another hard drive dies soon after, because as you're doing the rebuild or as you're just running that drive, it probably, whatever lightning strike or power surge happened, probably should have killed both drives at the same time, but one was barely holding on for life. So your same exact scenario of the rebuild process potentially killing it would do it. Now, for people that use UnRAID as their backup, that would be the only thing where maybe you wouldn't need a second then. I mean, technically you don't need a first, but that's a convenience that if you could afford an extra drive, I would strongly recommend, because having one of your backup drives die and you throw another one in, come back a day later, and it's already rebuilt itself, that's way more convenient.
I've got to say, Bob, is what many people kind of watching maybe thinking is RAID or UnRAID isn't actually a backup. Imagine like you're kind of, your array with parity. It's like a truck when they have the kind of dual tires on the back. If one tire blows, the truck will still carry on along. But, it isn't actually a backup, because, if you deleted a whole load of your data, if you just, deleted a whole data off a drive, you don't have a backup. It is only, disaster recovery from a failure of hard drive. It isn't actually a backup of your data. So, in the sense where if something fails, you can get the data back, it is. But, should, you have a virus that goes right the way through your network and destroys your files, or, you just accidentally delete a bunch of files by mistake, it isn't a backup to be able to get them back. So, people need to, think about, if they've got data, that's very important, make sure you have it in more than one place.
Yeah, thank you for steering me back on track on that, because I was going to go down the wrong road without explaining it right. Everything you just said is right, and thank you for saying it. I meant in the situation of like my current setup, where I have a desktop with all of my data on it, and the UnRAID server is my backup server.
Ah, I see.
So in that scenario, it is the backup. But if you're running this as your main file storage, you're right, 100%. Not only should you be backing that up, you should probably be doing it with offline drives if possible, or do what I've been doing a lot with friends, in that if you have a lot of shared data, like ROMs or favorite movies and stuff like that, we've each gotten an extra drive or two and saved it on each other's. So that way, we're not only do we get to share content, but we also are each other's backup, which kind of saves money and makes more sense to me, at least. I could be a little stingy at times. So to spend a lot of money on some drives that sit in a closet in my same house, so if the house burns down, if it gets robbed, I still lose all the data. I'd rather spend that extra money sharing my stuff with somebody else and have an offsite backup and all of that other stuff. But that's kind of...
Yeah, it's a great idea, I think, being able to have a hard drive, with a buddy, and, both of you be able to, swap data and have it offsite. That's a great idea, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, that's just old school nerding, I guess. But once you've gotten everything set up, and once you've decided that, okay, everything's cool, everything's running, I want to see what else this thing could do, that's when you go down a rabbit hole that's very time consuming, but could be very rewarding and efficient for your workflow if you need extra stuff like this. For me personally, one of the things that just saved a ton of time and annoyance is installing Make MKV, because my workflow, every time I get a new disc, so an Ultra HD Blu-ray, whatever else, I buy the disc, I put it in my computer, I rip it, and then I have to copy it from my computer to the network storage. And now I could have and I do have a drive right in my UnRAID server that I use Make MKV's UnRAID plugin to rip directly to the RAID array to save that extra step of copying it over the network. And I know that sounds weird, by the way, but I have a ton of friends that do the same thing, in that we don't ever actually watch our discs. They go on our shelf, they're displayed nicely, but they're all accessed through the network for ease of use and backup and all that other stuff. Yeah. So that all of that stuff can be found through the App Store. There's so many cool things about it, but from a retro gaming point of view, There's also things like virtual machines. So you could have one running on the server, and maybe you want to do your ripping of your games that way. You could use, if you have legacy software, you could be running a Windows XP virtual machine. And that's something that can get a little bit confusing. So do you want to give maybe a basic overview of what VMs are and how you've been teaching people to use them in UnRAID?
Sure. So, VMs, obviously it stands for virtual machine and allows you to virtualize pretty much any operating system at all. But what you can also do is pass through individual hardware as well. So, when you kind of run something like kind of VMware Workstation on a Windows desktop, you haven't got the kind of 3D acceleration that would allow you to kind of play modern games. But, with VMs and UnRAID and in Linux in general, KVM and QEMU, you can actually pass through individual hardware on the computer. So the VM has exclusive access to the graphics card. And sorry,
No, it's cool because this stuff is confusing, and the way you lay out your videos, you make it easy to understand, and you do it step by step. And I'm firing off these questions at you with out of context. So, I apologize for that.
Regarding retro gaming, though, is you can what's quite fun in the project I've been doing. Well, I've been doing it for years, to be honest. I made some videos. It must be kind of 3 or 4 years ago, where I installed Windows 98 and Windows 95, but I passed through hardware from the 1990s to that VM, and I'll show you something now that I've got here ready to show you. I'm not sure if you can see that there.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a hard drive enclosure I made, and inside here is a Sound Blaster sound card and also a Cirrus Logic graphics card. But this week I've actually ordered myself a Voodoo 3 2000 16 megabyte graphics card. Hopefully, that was a good graphics card back in the 1990s. I really can't remember. So inside of here is basically, I'm not sure if you probably can't really see, but there's a PCI slot there for old PCI. So I put the graphics card and a sound card into there, and then this connects into a PCIe slot on my UnRAID server. So for my Windows 95 and my Windows 98 VMs, I pass through that old retro hardware. So the VM has a real Sound Blaster, and when I get my Voodoo card, it will have a real Voodoo 3 graphics card. So it's quite nice that you can have a modern computer be able to kind of use old-fashioned hard drive and kind of have a hybrid system, enabling you to play retro games on the kind of original hard drive, on the original hardware from the day. And you can just emulate, with a virtual machine, you can emulate old CPUs. So you can emulate like a Pentium 2, Pentium 1. So you can emulate the CPU of the day and string it along with some hardware from the day. And yeah, I think that's quite a fun thing to do. That a lot of people don't think about with VMs. They think about passing through an RTX 3090, and that's the be all and end all. But you can pass through kind of any hardware, and even the old-fashioned hardware, so long as it's in an adapter like a PCIe to PCIe adapter, you can pass through hardware like that as well.
So that's absolutely awesome, and I could immediately envision 2 use case scenarios for that. First, you're sitting at your modern flat panel with your keyboard and mouse, and you just open up the VM, and you could use an old computer on your modern computer and have it be very accurate. But I could also envision somebody taking like a Raspberry Pi running Linux with outputting 15 kilohertz video or 31, depending on what system you're trying to emulate there, and using a VM through that onto a VGA CRT monitor, an RGB monitor, depending how old you go. And you're running this over the network, but as long as it's a wired network connection or a very good wireless and you're not in the city with all that interference, you could essentially have this running for very cheap. And it is very true to the original experience of this original equipment. Now, that hardware box that you built, what exactly is in there? So is that a PCI to PCI Express adapter going to a Thunderbolt port?
No, so it's just a PCI. It's a PCIe to PCI adapter. I bought it off AliExpress. I think it cost me about $25. And you just have like a little kind of PCIe card that plugs into the server, and then there's a USB cable that comes from that and just joins into that, and
That's pretty cool.
it's very, very simple, really. And then you pass through the adapter through to the VM, and UnRAID can see both devices that are plugged in. Sadly, you can only do it with PCI devices. AGP you can't do it with. I've never found an AGP to a PCIe adapter. So that's the kind of one limitation for retro stuff is it's PCI devices only. But still quite fun to do.
Yeah, that's a pretty awesome thing for retro computers. Now, what's the latency like in a VM over over an Ethernet connection in your LAN, not in a WAN scenario? So it's not that much at all, right?
No, so you mean like viewing a VM over the network on another computer? Yes.
Yeah, so like the latency for gaming, like if you wanted to play Quake the way you would in the 90s, are you going to feel some lag?
With the adapter box, there's no latency at all because you plug, the VGA straight into a monitor. The output of the graphics card goes into your monitor. So, it's just like having an old retro PC like that. So.
So you're running them both ways. You're running full VM on another computer, but you're also taking the video output of that old school Voodoo graphics card and going directly into a CRT.
So here's the on the old school graphics card. Here's the VGA out. Here's the sound out. I'll plug the sound into some speakers. Plug the VGA into a VGA monitor, and the graphics card. It's not viewed through any other computer. It is just working like that. So if your monitor can take a VGA, or you've got a VGA to HDMI, you can use it on any monitor, but you are using the original graphics card from the 90s in order to play your games.
That's
so
even
you can
cooler.
play Doom on a Voodoo 3 kind of natively, but on modern hardware, emulating the old hardware.
That is very cool. So you're using the original video card and the original audio card, and the only thing that you're really emulating is the CPU and bus. But with these modern PCs, there's probably zero latency to emulate the older CPUs.
No, so it's no problem no problem emulating the older CPUs, and you're just emulating the motherboard and the CPU, and then all the kind of peripheral cards you can use, the original cards from the day. So it saves you having to have like an old tower from the 1990s, but I'm sure it's much nicer to have the real thing, but sometimes it's quite hard to get hold of the older hardware, but if you can just get hold of an old graphics card and a sound card, you can build up something that's very small, like that little box you saw. You don't have to, it's more kind of wife and girlfriend friendly than having like a big beige box.
That's pretty funny. It's true, though, in that it's way easier to find single components like that than try to build yourself full machines. I know a lot of friends that have done it, and each time they always run into an issue with at least one of the major components. And obviously that, that puts the whole thing on hold. Whereas this, as long as your sound card and your video card work, you're good to go. So that's a very cool idea. Yeah. I'll definitely make sure to leave a link to that video in there. I'll leave another note for myself here.
Sadly, the Windows 95 video, I never made it in the end. I made them both at the same time, the Windows 98 and 95, and I accidentally deleted the Windows 95 one before I uploaded it. And there wasn't a great deal of interest in the Windows 98 one, so I never remade it, but it's definitely something I am going to remake, and especially as I'm getting my lovely new Voodoo 3 card, I will definitely be making some retro gaming videos for setting up some retro game VMs.
So I know the answer to this, but I would like, or at least I know my opinion to this, but I would like your opinion in why would somebody go through the trouble of using original hardware like this as opposed to just creating a VM that emulates everything, graphics card, sound card, and building like a Windows 95 VM?
You could build a Windows 95 VM and emulate everything, but the graphics card is going to be pretty bad. You're not going to be able to kind of, play games very well. The emulated hardware of like the graphics card is, in UnRAID, you're going to probably have to emulate a Cirrus Logic graphics card. And they're just not the best, but there's no reason why you can't, but the performance, isn't quite as good. And I guess, for retro gamers, the experience isn't quite so pure. It might be like, playing, Space Invaders on an original arcade cabinet is always going to be nicer than playing Space Invaders on your Xbox X in like a kind of emulator. So I guess it's a difference between like, emulators and the real thing. This is somewhere in between. So it's in between an emulator and in between the real thing. Not as good as the real thing, but not as
inaccurate as just full of software. Yeah, that's exactly my thoughts on it too. So I'm glad you feel the same way, because I think there's so many people, especially people that would be listening to this interview, to be honest, that appreciate original hardware in any aspect of things. And FPGA emulation is getting amazing and accurate, and it's such a cool way to do things. But sometimes there are many use cases where the original might still be a better choice for you, or not. That's why we talk about these things. That way people could choose what's best for them.
On RetroRGB and in Linux in general, you're quite limited on the types of graphics cards you can emulate as well. What was that you were talking about, the emulation in the P? What was that you said? Sorry, PG something. I've heard of it before.
FPGA emulation. Yeah, it's
So I've heard. I've never kind of like looked at that myself, but I have heard it. It's quite amazing.
So this is the dumbest analogy, but it's also super accurate in that, when you're talking about software emulation, you're having a piece of software that's running in a software language on top of a hardware layer that it needs to talk to, usually with an OS in between. So you could get super accuracy. You could get things that you would never get in the original that you might think are better, but it's not always exactly the same. And FPGAs are essentially like, imagine the Terminator from Terminator 2 that turns itself into other stuff. Such a dumb analogy, but also it's a really great way to visualize it. That FPGA chip, if programmed properly, will turn itself into the chips on the original boards. So there are at 486 cores now with, there's tons of arcade and console cores that are so accurate to the originals, to the point where you could take the code from one of the chips and flash it onto a smaller FPGA with a different pinout adapter and replace original chips from original hardware with it. That's how accurate it is. So it's awesome, and it's something that's definitely going to be a big part of the future of this stuff. But it's not the only thing, and it can't cover every scenario, at least yet. So that's why I love all of these different options we're talking about.
Oh, well, yeah, it's definitely something I'll have to have a look at. It sounds really cool.
Yeah, I'll send you some info on the Mister stuff after this. I think you'll be pleased with what you see. Now, another thing that retro gamers would definitely want to do is host their ROMs on a NAS in their own house. So rather than have, anytime you have the ability to access these things remotely, as opposed to on a micro USB card or micro SD card on the device itself, people, I think, would generally prefer that, because you have one location that you're dealing with all of this stuff. Adding and removing games is as easy as accessing a network share. You never have to remove any of this stuff. So you and I briefly talked about some of the things like that you've done. Do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you've done in UnRAID to help host files for game consoles like PS3 and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, you can set up very easily on UnRAID a PS3 net server. So you will need a modded PS3 for that to work, obviously. But you can host all of your PS3 ROMs and they're not called ROMs, are they?
ISOs, ROMs,
PS3 disk images, and play them over the network straight to your console. You just go through the list and you see see the box art of the game and play it. But also you can stream PS1 games straight through to your PS3 as well. PS2 kind of work, but they don't stream over the network. They will copy over the network to the internal hard drive on the PS3 and then play that way. So really, it's mainly PS1 and PS3 will stream over the network. I haven't as yet made a video to set that up, but it is something that I'm planning to be making in January. But if you've got a PS3 and you've modded it, definitely worth setting up, I think.
That's very cool.
Because you can obviously store a lot more disk images, obviously that you've attained legally.
Yeah.
On a NAS than any hard drive you're probably going to be able to fit inside a PS3.
Yeah, and I've always, I lived in New York City for a long time, so I had space issues, obviously. So I didn't have a setup where I could just leave everything plugged in. So for me to access my PS3, it was always a pain. You unpack it, take the hard drive out, or set it up to the network, copy something over. So if I just had the ability to plug that into the network when I was using it, and using the GUI on the PS3 access a different game, that would have been infinitely easier for testing and a lot of the work that I do, especially when I was doing stuff like testing what a PS1 game was like on original hardware, on a PS2, on a PS3, and emulation. Like that took forever. And I would have loved to have had a networked ability to do that.
Yeah, it's just super convenient, just to be able to play whatever game you like. You just get your PS3 out, plug it into the TV, connect it to the Wi-Fi, and you've got all of your games in a server that may be running in the cupboard under the stairs.
So there's going to be a lot more info about a network ROM sharing hosting project that I'm a part of. I'm gonna probably try to drag you into as well. If you talk to anybody else that I've interviewed, they usually say I follow up and bother them with things afterwards. And so everybody stay tuned for that. Make sure to subscribe to your channel, check out RetroRGB. I'll be making a big deal about it because I love stuff like this. There's a new mod for the Sega Saturn that you could install that very soon, if not by the time this airs, will have the ability to stream your Saturn ISO images from a network share to it, which is huge because now you could save a lot of money. And I think there's going to be a lot more like that coming up in the future. And you could even set that up with Mister. That's very easy to do. And of course, software emulation, obviously. But that's something that we'll swing back around to at some point in the future, I guess. But there is another thing that I definitely wanted to ask you about that I honestly don't know if I'm just going to be selfishly bugging you to help a project for my own or if other people will be interested in this. But I really do think other people would be interested in using VMs to have your UnRAID server be a multi-purpose device. I have always unreasonably wanted devices to be able to do more than one thing. Stubbornly. Like I have wasted so much time in my life trying to get like a media center that does everything rather than just, back in the day having a cable box and a media PC. And I'm trying to do the same thing with my UnRAID server because I don't want one box running 24/7 that's only used for backup. I would like to utilize it for other things. And I think anybody that's built a new PC or of course wants to switch to a laptop that's into retro gaming has run into capture issues because modern capture cards can't do a lot of the same things that the internal ones could have done, audio issues and other peripherals. So I think something that myself and many other people in the retro gaming world would have wanted to do is take a PC with a whole bunch of hard drive spots, fill them up with drives, make that your server, but also have it so that you could connect it to, maybe you have a setup with a bunch of retro consoles going through a scaler and you want to stream that way, rather than try to do all of that with modern equipment in a USB drive. You could have it all pre-connected in, and then you could do something like grab your cheap laptop, fire up a virtual machine, and you could be using that PC that you've repurposed to your server to stream your games, to do capture. But that's been a little trickier than I had thought because of passing through hardware compatibility. So do you think that's even a feasible idea, or am I basically just chasing the dragon here?
No, most definitely. if you can just plug in a PCIe device, all it has to be is in what's called its own IO-MMU group. So it has to be kind of like isolated without any other hardware in that group. When you pass it through, it passes through that hardware in the group through. So if you can plug it into a PCIe slot, the chances are you're going to be able to pass it through. There's various kind of, if things aren't grouped, how they should be, if they're not in their own separate IO-MMU group, you can use like the, you can use a patch in order to kind of separate things out. So, you can often, you most definitely you'll be able to do exactly what you want to do. Any kind of like PCIe capture cards that you want to plug in, you can pass them through to a VM. To be honest, I probably haven't really used a normal computer at home since probably 2015. Like the computer behind me here, this is a VM running.
Mm-hmm.
That's running Mac OS on UnRAID. Passing through a graphics card to that. Any other PCIe devices I put in, I could pass it through as well. As long as you've got enough space in the case to put them, you can pretty much pass through anything. So
that's very cool.
100% definitely.
I'm happy to hear that, because I genuinely think a lot of people would want to do something like this. I mean, in fact, even if you're a heavy content creator, I could completely imagine myself having a decent PC that has all of my capture cards and my editing software on it, and using UnRAID, because I can't tell you how many times I've been rendering on one machine, so I got to take out a laptop to do something else, but then I don't have the peripheral that plugs into the USB or Thunderbolt port, so do I transfer files? And it sounds like nonsense, but I know there's a bunch of people listening that are shaking their heads right now going, it happens to me once a week. So having a full other usable platform that's multi-purpose, so you're not just having two PCs on your desktop, you have one that does a lot of other stuff for you, I think would be a pretty big help for people. But there are a few requirements for that, right? Your motherboard needs to support virtualization at the very least, correct?
Yeah, so yeah, your your CPU and your motherboard need to support virtualization, which pretty much all modern CPUs and motherboards do. So your motherboard must, if it's Intel, support VTD and VTX and the equivalent in AMD. I can't remember what AMD call their virtualization now, but and IOMMU, it's called in AMD for the for being able to isolate hardware and pass it through. But one of the great things about using VMs is basically you can have a computer that's dedicated, a VM that's just dedicated to one task as well. So if you wanted to have one that was just kind of like for kind of recording, streaming and stuff, you can have a VM that's just dedicated for that. And once you've got it working, you can make a copy of the virtual hard disk it runs on and then store that somewhere else. So in a few weeks' time, if you kind of been messing around with it and it kind of breaks and you install something and it doesn't work, well, you just swap the virtual hard disk over, which is just a file. So you'd like replace the one there with the older file, and you're back to exactly where you were. And you can just have as well with kind of retro gaming, like I've got a few different virtual machines I use for retro gaming. I have a Windows one which I just run Launchbox on, and I don't have it doesn't do anything else other than that. Yeah, I could put it on, my normal Windows virtual machine where I kind of have other things as well. But I just like to keep it separate. So, if I want to do my retro gaming, I can just fire that up. And it's a dedicated Windows system for that. But it's all in one box. And also, I run like Lacquer as well, which is I'm sure you know about that, a distribution
very cool front end. Yeah.
For running games. So it's just it's really versatile, to be able to have one box that can kind of run multiple different systems. So you're not just stuck with one thing.
And there's so
and it's
much more that
super
goes
easy to
into
back
what you
up.
just said, though. Like the point that you just made is so important because, I've been doing IT since birth pretty much, right? So I back up my drives when I get them working right. So that way, whenever I'm at a point where something isn't working, I could restore from that image backup. But that is infinitely different than firing up your VM and going, something isn't working right. All right, rename it to, test, copy the other one from the array. Because I have, in my setup, I have everything stored on the array except the VMs. That's just on each virtual hard drive is on an SSD. And since they're only launched one at a time, that's not a big deal. But if that VM doesn't work anymore, just closing it and copying it back from the array to the SSD back when it was in a working state is like 3 minutes worth of work, as opposed to take apart the PC, put in your restore it from there. And also your point of dedicated images. I think everybody that hangs out on the R3 Discord is probably rolling their eyes right now because they've heard me jump in and say, my captures were working perfect last week and now something happened. And so to be able to have a dedicated, because I have a dedicated PC right here that I only fire up a couple times a year when there's a problem. And it's the same thing. You unplug wires, pull a new monitor over, hook up a new power setup, and to have a dedicated image that's just for capture, a dedicated image that's just for audio recording when you're doing more serious stuff. I mean, that's one of the biggest things too when I'm doing a multi-purpose computer is that, especially when I used to use Pro Tools, I would have to make sure that Pro Tools was installed and working, all of its plugins, the stupid USB stick, the iLock, then also Premiere, and then also my work stuff when I would do IT things. So to get basically 3 different full use computers working on one was so much harder. And if I had the ability to run VMs, I would just fire up a VM for every major task and then have one general purpose one that's just for web surfing and stuff like that, or not even use a VM, just use whatever I'm using to connect. So I'm glad you brought that point up, because while yes, IT people can do all of this stuff in big PCs, you could even have multiple drives in the same PC. So when you boot it, you just go into the BIOS and select which one you want to boot from. This is infinitely easier in every way.
Yeah.
So yeah, all excellent points.
And you lose very little performance. A lot of people think, when you're running a virtual machine, you're passing through maybe a graphics card and other things. Well, it's not going to be as good performance as if you're running it bare metal. But I think you just don't really notice the difference. I'd say you definitely get kind of like 97, 98% of the performance that you would get if you were running it bare metal. So
I guess a few more things for people that want to get started with this. So a very, very common scenario is to be able to go on eBay, or even better, locally to these IT surplus stores that take computers that 10 plus years ago, maybe they were $3,000 or $4,000 computers that you could get for $200 nowadays. I have 2 of those sitting here at least. If they do not support VTD, if they're Intel or the AMD virtualization that I'm also forgetting, there's nothing you could do about passing it through. You could still use it as an UnRAID server, but you can't pass
You can still use it as an UnRAID server, and if the CPU supports virtualization, you can run basic virtual machines, but without VTD, you're not going to be able to pass through hardware. But I've got an old Gen 8 HP from I think 2012, and that supports pass through. So what's that? It's 2022 soon, isn't it? So that's almost 10 years old. So it has been supported for many years. So you will probably find even the older enterprise stuff will support that as well.
I found that a lot of the stuff around 2011, 2012 and up, a lot of them have BIOS updates that allow you to add that feature in, and some of them don't. So of course the one, the UnRAID machine I'm running as we speak doesn't have that, but a couple of the other PCs I've been messing with do. So that's been kind of a cool thing. So once that's in, I think you'd probably agree that you would want a different drive to run your virtual machine off of. You wouldn't want to run it off of the RAID array. You would want to run it off of an SSD or an NVMe if possible, right?
Yeah, so it's much better to run your VMs off disk images off the fastest storage you've got. So the array with spinning Rust is going to be a lot slower than an SSD or an NVMe. So yeah, just the same as it would be if it was a real computer. It's going to be faster on an NVMe than it would be on just a 3.5-inch hard drive. So most definitely. And also you want to be thinking about how much IO is actually going to that drive as well for other tasks that might be on the server. So a lot of people like to run kind of like Plex servers, MB servers, for streaming video around their house.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to have, if you're running kind of VMs and you want good performance out of it, if you have a separate disk to be able to kind of run the VMs from that nothing else uses, then you're going to get better performance on the IO by doing it that way.
Now, is there a big performance hit from say you buy an SSD that's dedicated just for your VMs? Is there a performance hit from dropping a VM image on that and running it versus using that entire hard drive passed through as a full drive?
Passing through, you will get better performance. But it's one of those things like, you can get better performance on a benchmark playing a game. And, you might, when you kind of run a benchmark with something, you can get like X amount of frames per second with one graphics card and another. But in real life, you don't kind of notice it. So I would say, again, passing through a whole dedicated drive, you will get slightly better performance. But you're throwing away a lot of benefits by doing that. So
everything we just discussed about about the different VMs for a different purpose that goes out the window because you're using the full drive.
Also, what a lot of people don't think about as well is with a VDisk as well. What you can do is you can over provision your VDisk. So say you've got like a 1 terabyte hard drive as an NVMe, and you think, well, in the future, I might have like a 2 terabyte hard drive or a 4 terabyte NVMe, and you want to make a VM. So you can use something called a QCOW2 VDisk. And what this allows you to do is you set the size of the VDisk, and you can set it to any size you want, but it will only take up the space of the amount of space that's been used inside of that virtual disk. So on a 1 terabyte disk, I could put a 2 terabyte QCOW2 disk. And so then what I can do, you see, is I can have that on the server, and as it starts to grow, I can think, okay, it's almost got to 1 terabyte now. And so then I get a 2 terabyte drive and I copy that onto the 2 terabyte, and then it can continue expanding on the 2 terabyte drive. So as far as Windows, Linux, or Mac OS is concerned, it thinks it's got a 2 terabyte drive in there in the operating system, but it isn't. It's a virtual disk that can expand. But the performance is slightly worse on a QCOW2 disk than what's called a raw VDisk, which takes up the amount of space that the raw VDisk does. But again, you don't really notice it. I always say to people it's a bit like watching a movie in 4K. You can watch a movie in 4K. And when you go into the store and you see all these kind of, special videos that make it look great, it looks great. But, when you get home and you're kind of watching a movie, I'd rather watch like a good movie on a 1080p than watch a crap movie in 4K. When you're actually kind of using it in your real life, you don't notice it, and I kind of think that's like,
yeah, so I just ran into the exact scenario you described the other day when I was messing around with VMs, in that I have just a very small 128 gig SSD that I've been using for testing, and I put like 2 different Linux images and a Windows image, and I just put them all as 20 gigabyte drives just so I could mess around, and I immediately filled up the Windows one. So if I had used the expanding drive, I could have just set them all to 80 gigs, let's say, but they only would have taken up whatever storage they actually needed on there.
Yeah.
So, and all you would really need to do is pay attention to it, which is super easy on RAID. Just click on the main tab and you could see how full that disk is actually becoming. So that is a pretty cool thing. And that's something you should definitely do for when performance isn't the priority, you know?
Yeah, but all my VMs, even my gaming VMs now, I use QCOW2 for all of them. But I'm not a hardcore gamer, So anyone who's really into gaming, you probably shouldn't do that. But for casual gamers like me, I don't notice any difference in the performance.
I mean, to be honest, if you're a hardcore gamer, you would want to do the opposite of what we're talking about and build your badass gaming PC and only use it for gaming. And when you want to do anything else, fire up your VM that's sitting on your UnRAID server and use the VM on your gaming PC. So that way, if you're browsing and you get you have malware installed, it's all on the VM, even though you're technically using your gaming PC. So I think it still applies to hardcore gamers, just in the opposite of how we're discussing it.
A few years ago, I made a video which showed how to dual boot UnRAID with a Windows machine. So you could have your Windows gaming machine, and you could also have UnRAID on the same machine. So you could boot bare metal into the Windows gaming machine, so you get the full performance. There's nothing else running. But then what you could do as well is you could boot it into the UnRAID operating system, and then actually pass through the hard disk that you've installed your bare metal Windows on and run that as a VM inside UnRAID as well. So you're basically running a virtualized version of the bare metal. And so, when your UnRAID server's running, you can access that same VM, all the same programs and everything. But if you want to make sure you get the most extreme performance you can just reboot it directly straight into your Windows gaming VM, and none of the UnRAID stuff there is there.
That's very cool.
That's a bit more advanced, but it's quite a cool thing to be able to do.
It's that's a third scenario then, and that is the scenario for people that don't have the physical space for 2 towers. So that's perfect. Or if you don't have access to an older one for the UnRAID server, that's absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I've started testing, and I think I know the answer to, but I would love your opinion on, is when I'm using these virtual machines, I then take the UnRAID array and I map the network drive as if it were a local drive. And at first that made me nervous because I'm thinking, is this virtual machine going to be taking the file, sending it to my router and back to the same computer? But it seems that when you're in a virtual machine on the same drive that is on, or on the same box, so you're running the VM off of your UnRAID server, when you map that network drive, it is actually just passing it over the motherboard and not over the network.
Yeah. So no, it won't go down the network cable and back. So
because I ran some speed tests with that, and it seemed like a pretty solid numbers that showed the difference. The UnRAID array is kind of slow, so it was hard to see. Like on the right side, it was the same going over the network as it was in the VM, but reading it was twice as fast. So
yeah,
I just wanted to double check that because that's something that I doing IT, I just assumed that was the answer, but I wanted to both double check and reassure people that might not understand how a lot of that stuff works, that if you want to do it that way, that is safe to do, and that you're not just wasting bandwidth across your network for that.
No, it won't hit your network at all unless you're accessing it from another machine across the network. If it's a VM inside, it will just access it locally.
And that's the same no matter what operating system you're running. So even if you're running Linux and UnRAID is a Linux-based OS, you're still not going to see the drives show up as individual drives in your VM. You would have to map it like the network share, correct?
Yeah, you have to map it as a network share. Yeah, they won't show up. A VM, won't be aware of anything outside of itself. So the VM won't know that there's other hard drives in the same computer. So you have to basically give it access to data on a share.
Now, somebody had mentioned something the other day that I never considered, but they had mentioned leaving a keyboard, mouse, and monitor connected to their UnRAID server and then booting into the UnRAID GUI, because mine, in most people's, you don't plug any of that stuff into it. You have a power cable, a network cable, and then your PC that's just running. But if you hook all of this stuff up to it and you use the UnRAID GUI, and I think you have to run a Linux command to get it to match the resolution of your monitor, but you could run your VMs directly through there. So it's almost like, so you're using a VM, but you're using it on the machine itself. Is that kind of the same as what you were talking about with the pass-through on the gaming PC, or is that slightly different?
No, you'd be using like if you booted it up and ran a VM, and it shows in the browser, you're using an emulated graphics like VNC graphics you'd be using for that. So it's kind of similar. Obviously you could do that on a machine, where you don't have VTD or IO MMU, so you can't pass through hardware. So you would be able to actually kind of run a VM, on the screen itself. So,
that's interesting. So in the scenario of you don't have VTD or any of the virtualization, you would be able to boot into UnRAID, but still use it as a PC with a VM.
Yeah, I wouldn't think it's going to be the nicest experience ever, but yeah, it is possible.
Interesting. Okay. And there's so many different apps and stuff that you could get for UnRAID. So we're talking about virtualization and specific scenarios, but if you just need to get on and access files right from the GUI, because all of this stuff is done from your web browser, and even if you run the UnRAID GUI version and you're sitting there with a keyboard, mouse, and monitor, you're still running through the same browser and the same interface that you would if you did it remotely. And there are tools like Crusader I use all the time. Unassigned Devices, that's another great one that allows you to just plug in a drive. So one of the scenarios that I've run into is people, when they're migrating their data over, they'll get two drives, a parity and another main drive for their array. And then they have all of these old hard drives that they want to add. So they'll add it in, they'll plug it in with the SATA cable, and they'll use Unassigned Devices to just access that drive in its standard NTFS or whatever disk formatting is already on there. Then they use Crusader to move all of that stuff onto their array. And then they just go into the interface when they're done, blow away that drive and add it to their array. And that's how they build up their array of drives. And you could do this without virtual machines. You don't have to mess with any of the stuff that we've been talking about.
No,
you just on two apps.
Yeah, virtual machines are, totally separate to storing files on your UnRAID server. You just, like you say, use an app like Crusader, or if people are familiar with the command line, you can just use command line and copy it. That's a great thing. You can, like you say, have a stack of old hard drives that have already got data on. Obviously you don't want to wipe them because you want the data, so you just add one hard drive into the server, and then each hard drive add it in, copy the data onto the blank one, then format that one in the file system for UnRAID, and then do the next and the next and the next, and so on, until all of your data's on there.
Yeah, and this might be a
all
silly
of the drives
tip.
Are being used.
Yeah, and this might be a silly tip, but something that I found that I thought I just really loved that I could do this was I did exactly what we just described. So I'm waiting for data to copy over. I have my web browser with Crusader open. Once it starts copying, you could close your web browser and shut down your laptop, PC, whatever you're using. You come back a day later, you open up that web window, and it's been running the whole time. You don't need to leave access open. It'll be as if it's the equivalent of you turning off your monitor, walking away, coming back, and turning the monitor back on. So.
Yeah, it's a great way of looking at it. Like the UnRAID web GUI is almost like just a virtual monitor for UnRAID. So, like you say, when you shut your laptop down that you may be connected to UnRAID with, it is like just switching off the monitor.
Well, I mean, I have a much better grasp on this stuff now. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. But how did you get into doing instructional videos? Do you do this stuff for a living? You're very good at it.
Basically, my daughter wanted to do YouTube in about 2015, which I think when I started doing YouTube. And she said, she was too shy to do it. So I said, I'll tell you what, if you do a YouTube channel, I'll do a YouTube. So I made a couple of videos, and my daughter never made one. She changed her mind. I don't want to do YouTube anymore. It's boring.
That's funny.
So I kind of fell into it by chance.
That's pretty funny. Do you have an IT tech background, or did you just figure all this stuff out?
I do, yeah. I work in IT. Sadly, I'm too old to change now, so I'm kind of stuck with it. But yeah.
And I assume what you do is Linux based as well, right?
It is, yeah. But I've always had an interest in computers from when I was very young. My very first computer was an Atari 800 XL. Mm-hmm. You're a bit younger than me, so I'm not sure if you'd.
I'm 40, so my first computer was a Tandy 1000, and that was my dad's, and I kept wanting to mess with it, so he got tired of me using his computer, so he got me a TRS-80 color computer too. But the paths of the PCs in the US, way different from the PC path in the UK. So I'm discovering now, just in the past few years through friends, all of the amazing PCs that you all grew up with.
But I'm going to show you my pride and joy at the moment. I managed to get myself an Atari 800 XL boxed on eBay the other day. And another kind of little hobby that I've got is I like building modern hardware and old things. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to show you this. I'm going to try. Basically, that there is an Atari 800 XL where I stripped out everything inside of it and put an i5 processor, and that runs pfSense, so that runs the whole of my home network.
Oh, cool!
Above that, there, the PlayStation is actually a Unify access point. So inside of there, all of that was kind of like stripped out, and I kind of found that the Unify access point was about the same size as the disc of a PS1. So I thought, well, that will look a bit more cool than just having a Unify access point on the wall. So my router is a Atari 800 XL, and the access point is a PS1.
That is absolutely awesome. I love projects like that. Do you ever do videos on these, or is that just a personal project that you like to do?
It's just really a kind of personal project. I made a video once where I got an old N64 cartridge and put a hard drive in it and made it as an external hard drive, probably kind of 3 or 4 years ago. But it's not really something I make videos on, but it's something I quite enjoy. It was pretty fun making the pfSense in my favorite ever computer. So
that is absolutely awesome. Yeah, that was awesome.
So I kind of enjoy that kind of thing.
Yeah, I love projects like that. That's a friend of mine built. I think it was 2006 or 7. Took an old VCR that was dead, stripped it out, and made it into an HTPC. And when you pressed the eject button, the whole front of the where the flap would normally go in would come out, and that would be the DVD tray for it. And it was just awesome. It was really neat. I love silly projects like that, especially when you're repurposing old cases and old hardware and things. So
like I made that Atari one, probably again 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a fully working Atari, and then I was kind of very upset because my other working Atari broke.
Isn't that always what happens?
I should have just bought one, and I found now in 2020 they're about kind of 3 times the price than they were about 3 years ago in the UK. So
yeah, those things are going through the roof. It's a
bit of a shock.
So from the time that this airs on, I'm going to be referencing UnRAID and doing some posts on it, retro gaming related. So I'm very thankful that you took the time to come on and do this with me. I'm going to be using this as a reference every time I talk about it. So I would strongly recommend that people subscribe to your channel on YouTube. Are you on other social media platforms, or is it mostly just going through YouTube?
It's mostly through YouTube. I am on Twitter, but I don't post very often, to be honest. So,
Understandable.
if people want to reach out to me, it's mainly on YouTube.
So if you are a nerd or an aspiring nerd and you want to try to mess with your own backup system that could be more than a backup system, definitely check out and subscribe to your channel, and start with just an old PC and one drive and one USB drive, and that's all you need. We dug deep into nerdy stuff in this. You don't need to do any of that to get started, and see if it's something that you might like, and definitely pay attention to both of our channels going forward, because there's going to be quite a few retro gaming things that tie exactly into this and how you might need to use it or want to use it in your own setup. So thank you, Ed, very much for taking the time to do this. I'm positive we're going to be doing this again.
And thank you for inviting me onto your show. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So I will leave links to where everybody could find you, and thanks again.